Welcome. I'm Glenn Anderson with the Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation. This TV series explores a variety of issues that relate to peace, social justice, and nonviolent social change. This month, we'll look at immigration, not in the way that politicians and the mainstream media typically do. Instead of promoting fear and racist stereotypes, we will look at immigration realistically and humanely. We'll debunk some myths about immigrants. We'll understand how the immigration system is broken. We'll learn how immigrants are personally affected, themselves and their families. We'll expose how the government abuses undocumented immigrants. We'll find out what people, including people in our local community, are doing to solve these problems. And we'll suggest ways that you can get better informed and ways that you can help. I'm happy to welcome three guests who will share their knowledge, their insights, their experiences, and their recommendations for us. I'm happy to welcome Lisa Seifert. She's an immigration attorney in Olympia. She's also the president of the Washington chapter of the American Immigration Lawyers Association. Good to have you here, Lisa.
Thanks, Ben.
Happy to welcome Erika Marques-Santillan. She's the daughter of immigrants, and she's a volunteer with a new local organization called Bridges, Not Walls. Good to have you here, Erika.
Thanks, Glenn.
And I'm happy to welcome Jenny Blumenstein. She teaches English literacy for Spanish-speaking immigrants, and she also is a volunteer with Bridges, Not Wall. Good to have you here, Jenny.
Good to be here.
So let's begin by looking at what some of the things are that we keep hearing in our society, things that the general public, that the mainstream media and politicians sometimes say about immigration and immigrants. And we'll list some of these common notions that we keep hearing briefly now, and then we'll go through and explore these in depth in a few minutes. What do we keep hearing about immigration and immigrants?
Well, there's all kinds of things. I mean, you first of all hear that immigrants are here and they take people's jobs, or they use social services, things like that. Those are two things.
Mm-hmm. There's common assumptions that immigrants, there's racism and xenophobia behind. When we think about immigrants, a lot of things that come up, the assumptions that immigrants are criminals and they're here committing crimes and they're here drug smuggling and the cause for gang problems and things like that.
I think another thing that you hear a lot is, why do people come here illegally, as if there were another way for them to have come here, as if they chose to come here illegally. So that's another thing that you hear a lot in the news.
Okay, well, let's explore some of these in some depth and maybe some other ideas as well. Lisa, you're an immigration attorney, and so when somebody says, why don't people just come here legally like our grandparents did, What's your response?
That's probably the number one myth that needs to be debunked. You were right when you said people don't really have a choice. We have, these days in this country, we have 12 million people who are here undocumented, and in undocumented or illegal status. If there was another way, they would do it. Our immigration system doesn't permit it. We have a legal immigration system, but it's very, very limited, and for most employers, it doesn't work, and for most family members, it doesn't work. And so, given that, and given the fact that there's a huge job market, people will come however they can, and if getting a visa or coming legally is an obstacle, they will jump right over that obstacle and get here to basically be in our workforce.
Mm-hmm. When we were talking on the phone, you said, well, how do you know that your grandparents came here legally?
Well, that's true, too.
And that was an interesting thing. I thought, well, I know I've seen a copy of what my mother's mother had when she came, but I haven't seen the documentation for my mother's dad or either of my dad's parents.
Yeah, many people can find documentation about that through, I don't remember what the organization is, but at Ellis Island, when I visited there a few years ago, you could look it up. And I know that there's a website that has to do with Ellis Island. And I think the Mormon Church also does a lot of ancestry research. So you could find often, what ship the person came in on and when they came to Angel Island or Ellis Island. But sure, there's lots of people who came across borders that there was no record of, including Alberto Gonzalez's family members. When they questioned him in Congress about his parents or grandparents, he said he just honestly didn't know how they got here.
Yeah.
There's also a story in my family that we tell where my grandmother, who was from Russia and had immigrated to Canada legally, at some point, it was during the Depression, it was during the 30s, and they couldn't find work there, and they had family members in Detroit, in Michigan. And so at some point, my grandmother came across with some of her family members in a car dressed to go to the opera or to go to a show. And that's how they crossed the border into Detroit, Michigan, and then never went back to Canada and ended up staying there and establishing residency. So how they ended up establishing residency later on is unclear, but they didn't have papers to come into the United States when they did. And so that was in the 30s. And now, ever since then, of course, my dad was born here, and so was I, but that's part of our family history, too.
There's probably a lot of that in people's history if they were to look back. If somebody comes here without the proper documentation, without the papers, how could they get legal? What's the deal?
Well, first of all, often they can't. Every week we see several people that we have to say, I'm sorry, there's nothing that we can do under the current system to help you. So how can they get legal? I mean, it's impossible in many cases. Oftentimes I'll see a person and their employer just found out that their number one employee has a legal problem, and they want to help. This might be their number one person, their most productive supervisor of 25 or something like that, and the employer will do anything, pay anything, and they are just shocked that I might tell them, there's nothing you can do, or you have to wait 10 years to do that, and your employee would have to leave the country first to get the visas. So for many people who are undocumented already, they've either entered illegally or they've overstayed some legal visa. For many people like that, there is no solution now. They are stuck here.
People sometimes say, why don't you go back to your country and then come in legally?
Okay. Well, that's a good question. If they go back to their country and apply for a visa, what would it be? We don't have the American public in general doesn't have a good concept of that. If somebody applies for a visa in their country to come here, the most often used visa they would ask for is a visitor visa. That's what most people mean when they say that, because to apply for a work visa, the employer has to go through a long sponsorship program, which might take 5 to 7 years. To get a visitor visa, which I just mentioned, the person has to be intending to go back to their country. They have to have a temporary intent, and they cannot be planning to work here. And so that doesn't work. And many people, even if they are just coming for a visit, get denied. In countries that are poorer countries or developing countries, the visa denial rate for visitor visas is very, very high because people who get those visas come and overstay. So it's basically not possible for a person who's here in an undocumented status to leave and attempt to come back without a long process happening before they could come back. And one more thing I'll mention is that since 1996, when the laws changed, after somebody is in the country illegally for more than 1 year, if they leave, they're banned for 10 years. There's a 10-year bar in the immigration law now for after you have had more than 1 year of unlawful presence, and it is very difficult to have that waived. So it's real catch-22 for many people.
So the system is legally broken in ways that the general public just does not recognize.
I'd
The
agree
public
with
is
that.
not aware, yeah.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
We were talking on the phone, each of us, to prepare for the program, and you and I were talking about this, and you mentioned difficulties in just like applying for a passport or something.
Right. What I wanted to say about that is that there's this, immigration system that's set up, but it's not very accessible anyway. It's not as easy as people think to just get in the line and get approved to be legal here, right? It's a misconception that it's that easy. I, as a U.S. citizen born here, I've gone through so many obstacles to get something as simple as a passport, like just the documentation that is required, things that need to back up, my birth certificate and things like that. Times are getting more and more intense, and I think it's a system that is not accessible to begin with. And when people get caught up in it, there's loopholes in it, and yeah.
A point I wanted to make that's related to what we're talking about, you had spoken about myths or misconceptions. I think that with the issue of immigration, when you hear it spoken about in the news, oftentimes you hear about the individual immigrants, and immigrants are blamed as invaders, people who've come to our country to take our jobs, or different sort of myths that are spoken about. And immigration, as people are talking about here, seems to be a very complex issue. Complex pushing forces that might push people to our country, and also complex pulling forces that might attract people to our country, jobs and otherwise. And so it just seems interesting to me that we end up blaming the immigrant, when really, if you look at the issue, it's much bigger than any individual. And I think that's an important part of the discussion, is looking more at those forces that are pushing and pulling, and not simply looking at the individuals who are coming, because it seems very simplistic to blame them.
Yeah, and part of that blaming is the terminology. We talk about people as being illegal, when really it'd be more accurate to say they don't have papers or they're undocumented, but to call somebody illegal is more of that blame. It's an insensitivity.
And it helps to distance us when we use those
Right.
terms. If we call someone illegal, then in a scary way, it keeps us from seeing them as human,
Right.
and as people just like you or I.
What about the notion of those people are taking our jobs?
I'll just say something first. There are many, many industries that depend on migrant workers, mainly I would think legal workers. Even in Washington State, you and I talked about NALI. I think that is stopping production of pickles or something like that now. They're not going to do that in the state anymore because they can't find the produce, because the growers can't find the workers. There's serious problems in eastern Washington with harvesting asparagus and apples, and it's because the growers cannot find the workers. They can't find any workers, U.S. citizen workers, any kind of workers. So it is a real misconception that immigrants take jobs. There's lots of jobs that are available, and nobody's being displaced that can actually be proven by any studies.
And there are many industries, obviously, as we all know, that really depend on immigrant labor that would come to a standstill at this point if it weren't for the hardworking immigrants that are working in those industries, such as construction or agriculture, lots of service industries, restaurants, in the area where I live, some of the shellfish industries. So really, it's a contribution that people are making to come fill these positions and keep these industries functioning.
Yeah. And for employees who have great skills, you mentioned a few minutes back about it. If somebody has like a really great employee who turns out not to have the proper documentation, there's nothing the employer can do to fix the problem in many cases.
No, and it's a worse problem than that, because once the employer knows that that worker has some problem with their papers, then the employer actually has a legal problem, right? Because our employment laws require some employers to make hires of knowing, or they can't have a knowing hire of an unauthorized alien. That is a criminal violation. There can be enforcement action taken against an employer, and so the employers always want to avoid liability, and that's where the I-9 concept, the I-9 form came from, immigration laws that were passed in 1986. So you can look at a person's documents, and the person has to sign a piece of paper, and as far as everybody knows, for most workers, everything is fine, the employee is authorized, but once that knowledge changes for the employer, all of a sudden that person has a liability issue that he or she has to think about, and they care about the employee usually, so it's terrible kind of conflict.
We often hear about those people are using up social services, and they're going to the emergency room in the hospital, and they're getting food stamps, and they're getting welfare and all these kinds of things. What's your response to those kinds of charges?
I would say that's also a myth that we're bombarded with, kind of like in mainstream media, and made to believe that there's this public welfare system that is there for people that are not willing to put their contributions. But in the reality, immigrants are paying huge amounts of taxes, and those are taxes, tax return money that they won't ever see again. And I know about families and mothers who won't try to access any of welfare support because of fear of being deported or being targeted because of your legal status. And just in terms of some of the examples of patrolling neighborhoods, like ICE activity, that type of stuff, when there's that kind of fear and terrorism in the community, folks are even hesitant or fearful of calling the police, and that's probably another subject, but it's
and we'll get into that.
This accessibility, this feeling that these communities are not going to go and seek these services.
So many of the immigrants that I know who may be undocumented can't access certain kinds of welfare programs, like TANF programs. You're not able to access them.
The federal aid for families.
Right. You're not able to access them without a social security number that's valid. Now, there are other programs that you can access, but as Erika was saying, so many of the immigrants that I know are working and making money, and that doesn't mean that they don't sometimes need additional help, but these are people who have incomes and are working, and they're not sort of just waiting around for someone to give them a handout. And they're also paying taxes, and maybe we could talk about a bit of the way that they do that. I mean, through their jobs, taxes are taken out of their checks, and they also pay rent, and so they contribute, or that some own houses as well, so they're paying property tax.
The sales tax, we have a very high sales tax rate in this state because we don't have an income tax, a state level income tax, and that's over 8% right there that goes into things. And if you're using somebody else's social security number, which you need to get a job, you use somebody else's. When you come to the age or develop a disability where you need your social security benefits, you'll never get those because that's somebody else's number.
Right.
Yeah.
The money is still taken out for income tax from your paycheck, like you said.
And they'll never see it again.
And
But I need to jump in, Glenn.
Yeah.
People don't necessarily use somebody else's number. I mean, I think that's generally not how it happens. People have numbers that are false. I've had many people tell me, said, well, where'd you get that number? Well, I bought it from somebody, or I invented it. I think it is not at all the case that somebody intentionally uses somebody else's number, and that would be another myth that we better not perpetuate, because there are a lot of people in the communities that think when you hear about people with false social security numbers, they right away think identity theft, and that is not what's happening in the. But when you say use somebody else's number, that's kind of where that goes.
Okay.
So I think that's not happening.
All right. Well, using a number that's not their own.
Yeah, using a false number.
Yeah. Okay.
And I'd like to say one more thing about benefits, and that is that legal immigrants and undocumented immigrants are not eligible for most, well, for any public assistance programs that are need-based. Mothers with children can get WIC before a child is born, and the U.S. citizen children born here, of course, are eligible for benefits. But since I don't remember when the law was passed, it's not possible to access public benefits. And so unless by, there are some programs that Jenny was starting to talk about that might be made available. Our community, Washington State's very good in that way, but generally speaking, federal benefits are just not available, and so you cannot get general assistance, the TANF. You cannot get so many things until a person is a citizen, and many people are never going to get there, so they can't access public benefits in the traditional sense.
When a few minutes ago we were talking about immigrants, and one of you was saying about how, you know, why people come here, or maybe people are kind of being pushed here. I don't know if you were saying that. Somebody, I've narrowed it down to one of the three of you that was saying that. I think it might have been you, Jenny. But can we talk some further about why people immigrate? What's going on?
Individually or
Whatever.
societally?
I think people are coming here out of bare necessity. For the most part, I would say that if people are hungry in their own countries, they're going to move, they're going to migrate. We're going to have this migration always. I think it's globalization. I think it's bad economic policies that are devastating economies, and people are being forced out. Like labor sectors are being wiped out too, through privatization of like farming, for example, in Mexico. And crops are getting privatized too. So people's livelihoods are just being swept out, and people are being pushed out of their countries. I don't think people come here by choice. I don't think that they want to be here. In fact, a lot of people that I talk to, and my background too, it was really not a choice. It was a survival. It was, I need to eat, I need to feed families, I need to do this, and they came.
Yeah, that was the case in my family. All four of my grandparents were born in Norway or Sweden, two in each. And shortly before, well, right around 1900, they all came over for that very reason. It was like there was just no way to make it at home, and they thought they'd have a better chance over here. So one by one, they came over. And that's still the process. And when you talk about what happens with people getting pushed off the farm, and we have like NAFTA and these other so-called free trade agreements that allow U.S. farmers to ship corn or other grains into other countries, and our government is subsidizing these, and they undercut the farmers there, and the farmers in those countries can't afford to grow at a comparable and sell it at a comparable rate, and they get pushed off the land. So they end up, you know, some of it is our economic policies, our political policies.
Yeah.
And I think there's a real element of commitment to family that's evident when you look at immigration, and I see this with the people that I've met through the classes that I teach. When people come to this country that I've met, they're here on behalf of others that they've left behind. And sometimes they're able to bring their whole family, but many times they're here working alone or with a brother or an uncle and sending money back to parents and younger siblings. And I've met many, many young men who are in their early 20s who have sacrificed to come here and work so that their younger siblings can actually finish school and finish high school, and they wouldn't be able to do that without the income generated by their brother that's here in the U.S. working. And I just find that to be an amazing demonstration of commitment to family. I mean, I know that in the family that I grew up in, I didn't really have to make those kinds of sacrifices, and better yet, my parents sacrificed for me, you know, to be able to have opportunities. And so I just think it's amazing to see these young men who've sort of sacrificed their own future in some ways to work on behalf of their brothers and sisters. So
I'm also mindful of people who've come out of countries like El Salvador, Guatemala, where the United States has supported right-wing governments that are very, very violent toward people down there who are dissatisfied and want change, and we militarize those countries and send death squads out there to kill people who disagree with their governments, and the people have to flee as refugees, but they can't get refugee status here because those are the United States government's so-called ally nations, and they're not really, the United States won't recognize them as refugees.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there's some of that push out of the country as well as, the economic draw.
And the pull piece is also really important, I think, as Americans for us to recognize is what is the pull of coming here. And some people talk about the American dream and a new opportunity, and that's all true to some degree, but the hard reality is also that we really depend on this labor for the functioning of our country, and we benefit from it. So, whether it's landscaping, construction, roofing, any of these industries, being able to keep those products affordable to middle-class America depends on having people who are willing to fill these positions and work in these positions. So I think it's something that when we talk about immigration, Americans really need to look at this through a different lens and start to recognize the benefits that they receive from immigration and start to recognize the contributions that immigrants are making instead of simply, taking a negative approach to this, because we're benefiting from this as well. And it's not just an opportunity for people coming, but our economy and our life, our standard of living benefits from this, and it's something that we don't often recognize.
And it's not just Latin America. Most of the examples we've been giving have been from Latin America, but you must have clients from lots of other places. I mean, the
Yeah, we
immigration
do.
laws pertain.
Well, the immigration law is federal.
Yeah.
It's not specific to any one country, except for certain policies related to Haiti and Cuba and things like
Right.
that. But sure, I mean, over the years, I've been in practice now almost 20 years, and we've seen people from, I think, 130 some different countries, which everybody says, how can that be in Olympia? And I say, how can you possibly make a living? How are there any immigrants in Olympia? It's like, well, every day we have appointments booked out for a long time. So sure, over the years, I've seen a lot of people from Mexico and Central America and South America. We see Brazilians, Venezuelans, quite a lot of Filipinos in this part of the region. Canadians, of course, those are the invisible aliens. You can't tell somebody's Canadian. They don't even have accents. Sure, I mean, not so many of the Africans, but some of the North African countries, there are people here. My colleagues who do the same work I do in Seattle do see a lot of Somalis and Eritreans. Of course, we all see people from Europe and Asia. I mean, Asia's in the Olympia area. We have a lot of people who previously came as refugees from Vietnam and Cambodia, who now are sponsoring their relatives. So lately, our office is doing a lot of fiance and spouse cases for those Southeast Asian countries, which is fun.
Okay.
But yeah, a lot of different countries.
We part of the way the politics plays out in this country nowadays has to do with concern about not so much our Canadian border, but the southern border and this wall between us and Mexico. And I wonder if somebody, Jenny, could you tell us something about the so-called border security issue? And if we can keep it kind of tight, we've expanded so much on what we've been talking about that we've got to have a lot of things yet to cover.
People talk a lot about being concerned about the southern border and making it impermeable and making sure that it's under control. And on some level, there is a certain level of importance in knowing who's coming into your country. But the sad thing is that a lot of really innocent people are sort of caught in the middle of all this. So there's a lot of money now that's being invested in a bigger, better wall. Pretty, tough task to achieve to build a wall that would be the length of the border, because it's many hundreds of miles long and fairly unrealistic and extremely expensive. And also surveillance equipment that's being installed. And what it's done in the end is it's made it much more difficult for people who want to come here to work to get here. But rather than cut off the flow altogether, what it does is just force people further out into the desert, into more difficult, sort of longer stretches of desert in order to get here. And so a lot of innocent people who simply want to come to the United States to work are kind of caught in the middle. There's really a lawless area where, there are drug gangs and other people who kind of wander and take advantage of the same immigrants who are coming to work here. And so a lot of innocent people, I think, are affected by this strategy that doesn't at all provide any legal means for people to come here, but simply makes it increasingly difficult for people to cross the border. And it's a very expensive policy to implement as well.
And there's some hypocrisy in there. I've done some reading in February. The Texas Observer, a respected publication, reported that the wall starts and stops sort of depending on whose land it's going through, and if you're a rich person, especially one who gives to the Republican Party, they won't be building the wall right there on the edge of your property because it'll spoil your view, but they'll put it through some poor person's property. And there's a golf course there, the Riverbend Resort and Golf Course, where the wall comes right up to it, stops for the expanse of that golf course, then picks up again on the other side. And there's a billionaire Republican donor from Dallas, a guy named Ray L. Hunt, he's a close friend of George W. Bush, and he was able to get the wall not built on his land, which actually borders the Mexican border, but they were going to run the wall through the land of some other guy, a Mexican-American guy who's been here he's worked as a migrant farm worker for 50 years in the U.S., bought some land, built a modest brick house, and they were going to run the wall right through where his house is, because he's relatively powerless, and it made kind of a stink about it. So they're going to move it, so it's still going to run on his land, but he won't have to demolish his house to have the fence go through it. But they're not going to run it on the land of the billionaire Republican donor.
And I wanted to add something about just this concept of a physical border, that just this picture, this overlooming picture it creates in our lives as people, that there's this wall that is intended to keep us safe. Face it, we live in an age of intense militarization, and the border, that wall is one example, right? And then there's I keep coming back to police, and then ICE, who we'll talk about a little bit, but there's increased militarization in our communities that we need to be fearful, and we need to be watchful, and we need to be afraid of those others. And so I think on a grander scale, it does something to us as humans, as people.
Yeah, fomenting that fear. And then ICE, which you mentioned, is the Immigration and Customs Enforcement. It's the part of the new Department of Homeland Security that replaces the old Immigration and Naturalization Service. And I wonder if somebody could tell us something about the raids they've been conducting in Shelton and elsewhere. Both of you have been working on this a lot.
In the past year or so, there's been an increased amount of ICE activity, Immigration and Customs Enforcement activity, in the community where I live in Shelton. And I've lived in Shelton for about 8 years, and previous to this past year, there really weren't many ICE activities to speak of in the time that I lived there. There had been previous to that occasionally, but there'd been really nothing to speak of for years and years and years. And so just starting in 2007, there was a big ICE raid at an apartment building in May of last year, where they went looking for a couple of individuals, and it's a tactic that they've used in different communities where they'll have pictures of a couple of individuals, and they'll start knocking on doors asking if people know or have seen these people. And as soon as you open your door, they have the right to suddenly come in if you've opened your door, and then they'll start to interrogate people who are in that apartment, even if they're not the people they're looking for. And if you don't have papers, they'll take you. So that's a strategy that they used in this apartment building, and they were able to take several tens of people, perhaps 20, 30 people in that incident. And then since January of this year, there's really been a heightened amount of activity. And rather than having just one incident or another incident, there's been several things going on almost every week, it seems, in the Shelton community. And it's varied. Some of it focuses around that same apartment building. They've been back there in the early mornings when people are organizing to go to work, and there's a lot of carpooling that goes on in the brush industry in particular when people work out in the woods. And so they've come and sort of tried to catch people as they're getting into their vans in the morning, and have been successful on several occasions. And there were also a couple of incidents that happened out in the woods. And in those incidents, it appears that ICE collaborated with other state law enforcement agencies, like, for example, the Sheriff's Department or the Police Department. And people were stopped on a road kind of out near Forest Service property, also collaborating with Forest Service personnel. And people were asked for their driver's license and their car insurance, just like a normal traffic stop, and also their brush permit to pick brush. And many of the vans had all of those types of documentation, but then the ICE officer approached and asked for people's documentation to be and work in the United States, and that's where people weren't able to produce that, and various people were detained. And there's also been several incidents, the likes of which we'd never heard about previous to this year, where ICE agents have gone to people's homes directly. And it seems as though people who may have been in process with their paperwork, their immigration paperwork, but somehow fallen out of status or were denied legal status at some point during the process, their names are in a database, and ICE has made a strategy of going to their homes directly to pick them up. So there's an example of a man who was married with 3 children, and one day he was working on his car out in his front yard, and ICE agents showed up to his house and took his wife. And she apparently is somebody who suffered from some kind of nervous disorder. She had, just anxiety. And so she fainted during the incident, and ICE agents actually had to take her to the emergency room before they could then transport her to the detention center in Tacoma. And they took her even though she had fainted and had this kind of incident, medical incident during the raid. They came back a few days later for their 18-year-old son, who's a high school student, and had been in the United States since he was about 4 years old. So he's basically grown up in the U.S. and is quite a good student apparently in the high school, and is now in the detention center in Tacoma. So there's been various families affected in that way too, where ICE agents have actually just come to their home. Families were never expecting that, and just one day suddenly people were taken from them.
Yeah, and that's got to be disruptive to any family. You were going to say something?
I know something about that. The databases that all the government agencies use are much, much more interrelated than they have ever been. And our organization does a lot of advocacy. We do a lot of liaison also with...
That's the immigrant lawyer?
The American Immigration Lawyers Association, AILA. We have a real active local chapter, and one of the things we do is have quarterly meetings, or more often if we need to, with ICE, for example. And we ask them that. So are you really doing sweeps? Because the rumors in the community is that ICE will come in and do a sweep of a whole employment place or a whole apartment complex. And what they tell us, and I believe this is true, is that they have information about specific people who perhaps have been deported previously. And so there's actually a warrant. And in that, that's what any law officer needs to arrest somebody or enter their property, is a warrant. They know now when somebody's been deported and when they come back. That information is available for the first time. I've never really heard about that before this year, but I've heard about it from clients and community members in the Centralia area, mainly. That's where I hear about this. So ICE could be looking for somebody who is in that kind of status. They also collaborate with the courts, and so we know, or they know, when there are people who have criminal convictions, who are finished with their criminal case. The ICE officers are at the jails and at the prisons, but so if they know somebody is in unlawful status and they also have a criminal conviction, they'll be looking for those people specifically. But then, of course, when they get to a place where there's more than one person, if they have an opportunity, they'll query everyone. And once the officer's in your face or in your apartment, you don't really have a choice but to talk to them. What we do try to strongly advocate for people is that you don't have to talk to these officers. And this is pretty hard to tell the immigrant population, who really, as I was saying before, they want to be legal, they want to comply. So if a police officer or some law enforcement officer, including an ICE officer, is knocking on the door, hi, I'm from ICE, let me in, or I'd like to talk to you, or can I talk to you? The people need to know that they don't have to say yes, that they do not have to open the door. You don't have to talk to somebody who walks up to you on the street. You can say no, thank you, and leave. But that's kind of a tough thing to educate people about, but it's important.
It's hard for anybody where there's that huge power imbalance.
Right.
Somebody is in this official position of enormous power, somebody else is extremely powerless. It's hard to say no to somebody with all that power.
Yeah, people don't believe they have that right.
And I think people are used to opening their doors. We talked about this at some point, but it's amazing just to think for a moment about you or I sitting here. What would it feel like to be so afraid to open your door that you would have to sort of peer through a window? I mean, I think we're so used to living in a society, and it feels good to live in a place where you can feel comfortable opening your door and welcoming people into your home. And so I think it puts people in a whole new frame of mind that nobody wants to be in, where you're fearful to go to the store, you're fearful to open your door. And it's pretty unbelievable just to think about that reality for a moment. What would it be like to go to Walmart or to go to the store and I say Walmart because it's a big store in Shelton, and a lot of immigrants shop there, and to not know if you're going to come back again. So it's a scary reality.
Yeah, and people do have a sense of hospitality. You know, you have friendly people who come from a culture where everybody's connected and there's a lot of neighborliness and connectivity. And opening a door seems natural. We're running a bit late. I do want us to talk about the detention center in Tacoma. One of you mentioned the detention center that ICE runs, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement. It's off of I-5, sort of in the industrial area of
Port of Tacoma.
Port of Tacoma area, southeast of downtown. And can you tell us something about what it's like?
Sure.
goes on?
I've been to the detention center, not inside necessarily, but I've been to a couple vigils that take place there once every month on a Saturday, and just doing some outreach and talking to people, family members that are basically traveling for miles and miles. I've talked to people who have driven from Los Angeles to come see their brothers in Tacoma because they were stopped driving from Canada or something coming into this state. And she found out very last minute, had to basically drop everything and go, including her kids. She had to leave them behind in Los Angeles and just kind of come up here with her sister. And so traveling miles and miles, gas is expensive, having to leave work and then leaving children behind, and then getting here and being refused entry into the detention center to see her brother. The reason that the ICE guards gave was that there's one visitation limited, one only per day that she gets to go in, and so
It's not even every day. I
Yeah.
think it's a very limited time period. Maybe it's 3 days a week.
And so just stories like that, and from other peers that have gone to kind of support families that are coming out, they've talked to family members that literally have faced or witnessed a discrimination when you're obviously a woman Latina with her child, and she was told, no, you can't go in, but she kind of stuck around a little bit, and to see that, not to throw out the stereotype, but that other Arab community members were coming in, they were just being let into through the gate, and so she experienced some of this discrimination even there, but just tons of stories, and the things that I've heard from inside the detention center are even worse. People are not treated with adequate health attention, malnutrition too, like there's not enough, it's either really poor food, not enough for people, so like they get fed very little, and people are literally fighting for food or near starving. I've heard that mothers and fathers and children are separated too. So it's just a very dehumanizing process, and it starts, I think, once they had to confront crossing that border, and then the raid that takes place, and then being placed in this detention center, being treated as a criminal. And I think the public sees that and has this misconception that everyone that is in there deserves to be there because they are either violent offenders, rapists, drug dealers. These are things that I've heard from people just in my community, in society.
Well, now the detention center is operated by a private corporation that owns and runs a lot of other prisons, so they have a strong incentive to keep costs down, and you can certainly economize if you don't provide adequate food, don't provide adequate health services, or do overcrowding. But it's also built on a former Superfund site that was just terribly contaminated by toxins during the industrial use of that land.
We've also heard it's very crowded and overcrowded, and more and more people coming in every day, and it's very expensive. Besides the food that's provided, which is very low quality, and apparently there was some kind of food poisoning incident a couple of years ago that was very serious, and aside from all of that, people can buy certain things in a store there, but of course it's very expensive and very overpriced, and there's no way to get anything in from the outside. It's all controlled by the GEO group, which is the group that you were mentioning, is the group that's contracted to manage that facility.
We in the context of what we're doing, it's important to realize that immigrant rights are human rights. There are basic human rights that every human being is entitled to, and somehow these get set aside if we think, well, somebody's an immigrant or they don't have proper documentation, therefore they're not as human as the rest of us. But human rights are for everybody, and immigrant rights really are human rights, and that just keeps getting squeezed out of the public conversation. We want to talk, we're running late, but I want to make sure we get a chance to talk about Bridges Not Walls, which both of you are working with a lot. Can you tell us something about the organization, and then we'll talk about the conference that you're working on?
Sure. Bridges Not Walls it's a collective, it's an organization of people. We're basically all volunteering our time and energies into to mobilizing the community to really build this as an immigrant rights movement, as the human rights movement. And so there's, I don't know, maybe 30 folks that are just volunteers from various organizations. I am a student. I'm a daughter of immigrant parents, and I'm kind of putting myself in that group too, along with other folks that are coming from other areas of social justice. And we meet, I don't know, twice a month since I think we started in September. And the idea for the conference was for someone in the group. She's a filmmaker, faculty at the Evergreen State College, and she had this idea. She did some work at the border with another community member who's from Shelton, and it just started getting more people involved and building more support, and the group is huge, and it's a magnificent group of people, and so this is how the idea for the conference came.
Yeah.
I
want to plug in the phone number and the website, and then we catch the conference. The Bridges Not Walls as an organization, you can phone them at area code 360-280-6480 or at 360-539-4825, and the website is www.oly-wa.us/bridges.
Before I talk about the conference, I just want to mention really quickly about the group that some of the goals of the group are to kind of raise awareness about this issue of immigration in our community and how it affects us both at a national level in this country, but also at a very local level. And we want to be working in collaboration with the local immigrant community to raise awareness and respond to some of these challenges that are going on around us. And the conference that we're planning is a part of that effort to raise awareness and to learn more about immigration. And it's going to be happening May 15th, 16th, 17th, and 18th.
It's a Thursday through Sunday.
Thursday through Sunday of May 2008, and it's happening at the Evergreen State College. And there's going to be presenters coming from both the border region in the southern border, and also from the northwest region. And these are folks who work with organizations that are trying to address immigration in constructive and positive ways in our society, and working with communities and with immigrants to have a voice for change on immigration. So it's a real opportunity to learn and to talk with other people and to hear new ideas, and also to strategize about ways that we can promote a more constructive approach to immigration in our country and in our community.
Erika, you were interested in mentioning the Monologues.
Oh, yeah.
Tell us about that.
The Monologues is a collective of 5 women who will be telling the stories of our mothers through our eyes, talking about the migration experience and how that sort of shaped our identities being first generation in this country. And that's just another aspect of talking about immigration with a human voice, you know, because it's telling the stories that that have shaped us and why we're here, and yeah.
Yeah. There's a lot of what we've talked about is fact-based, or it's the legal thing, or it's how the system is, but that human thing, the fact that these are human rights and very rich with human stories, is so much a part of it. We want to mention there are a lot of other organizations that people might not know about that are doing wonderful work. I want to mention them just quickly, and I want you to tell us something about a couple of these. There's one called Inmigrantes Unidos that works with in the Shelton and Mason County area that does some good work, and you work with them.
Yeah, I started working with them through an ethnography project that I did on my father's migration experience, and I got connected with this group locally. I'm originally from Los Angeles, so it was a connect to this community. And it's just been a really interesting experience. Some of the work that they do some cultural celebrations, so an awareness in the community to strengthen their identities as immigrants.
Yeah, there's in the Olympia area, there's a Cielo project, CIELO project, and they do a lot of different useful supportive work, literacy and social services. They're a great organization that's rooted in the community, and we have their phone number and their website that we'll be listing, including at the end of the program. We'll recap all of these. Want to also put in a plug for the Northwest Immigrant Rights Project. They're based in Seattle. They have Eastern Washington location in the Granger, the Yakima Valley area, and they really do great work on immigrant rights from a legal standpoint. The organization you're with is with the American Immigration Law Foundation.
Oh, right, I'm a member of the American Immigration Lawyers Association, and then there is a foundation which does a lot of great policy work, and on their website, that ailf.org, there are many papers about some of the things that we've talked about today.
That sounds fascinating. We want to do that. And there's also, based in Seattle, there's a group called Hate Free Zone that came along and became pretty prominent after the September 11 events, and they're looking at especially discrimination and hate crimes even against people from the geographic regions that are affected by that. Let's talk briefly, we've only got a few minutes left, but could you just lay out, what would you like to see in the way of reforms? And can you do this in like a minute or two?
Sure. As I said, the system is pretty broken. To fix it is a huge job, but it would be great if we had a system which actually could match up willing employers with willing workers. That if it was possible for people to come legally, we wouldn't have an illegal immigrant problem. This new system should also make it possible for people who are here and they're kind of stuck because they're undocumented or they've lost their status, make it possible for them to earn legal status in this country. Those would be two of the most important things there. And I think we should actually get control of the borders so that we know who's here and who's not here. I think those three things are probably really, really important. They would go a long way to helping the system and stopping the long waiting lines too. We didn't really talk about this, but family immigrants are separated unnecessarily by many, many years. And so we should make it possible for a person to bring their spouse here, short of 5 years, for example.
The system currently is breaking families apart. It's keeping spouses apart, keeping kids away from parents and vice versa.
Unnecessarily. We don't have to have it be that way.
Right. I'm interested also in some reforms that would look at the root causes to make sure that we aren't doing things as a nation that are making the problems worse in other countries, that are pushing people out, like the kind of foreign policies that we've had in Central America, where we've made life unlivable for so many people, where they've had to get out just for fear of their lives, or the so-called free trade policies that make it impossible for people to earn a living at home, so they have to find someplace else to go. What would you like our viewers to be doing? Certainly we can get some information from these websites that we'll be listing at the end of the program. They're wonderful sources of information. What would you like the viewers to be doing as a way of helping to solve the problems?
I guess reach out and learn more, and make sure that when they're listening to this debate about immigration, they're looking for the human element and recognizing that we're talking about people when we're talking about immigrants. And through organizations like Bridges Not Walls, we want to be able to connect people to each other and help us all understand this issue more so we can advocate for a more progressive, more positive approach to this issue.
Yeah, I would hope that people would come out to the conference if you're watching this program before middle of May. If you're watching it after middle of May, after the conference is over, I would imagine that there would be resources posted at the website.
The conference will be an excellent opportunity to learn more and to connect, and then once the conference is over, we hope to be working on projects to help address some of these challenges like the raids that are happening in our communities and help support the families that are affected.
Right. And I think just having people get informed about what's happening and not be led by common stereotypes or just xenophobia that's driven, and also racist misconceptions about people, to kind of get out there, challenge yourself as a person to reach out, get involved, get connected, and keep informing yourself about what's happening, the reality of the situation.
Lisa, what would you like people to do?
The same thing. I mean, reach out and find out who's in our community. These two said it very well.
And change the laws in these humane
Well,
ways.
of course.
We've done
Work
that.
on Congress to change the laws so that we
Right.
have a system that works, because it is possible. We shouldn't just give up. It is
Right.
possible.
Community should take a stand.
Great, thank you. I'm glad you're all here. It's so easy for people to pass judgment on other people who are in a situation that's not a situation that we happen to be in. We who are citizens don't have too much opportunity to connect with people or to understand firsthand the realities of people who are not citizens, especially those who are struggling against a system that's stacked against them. And we do have to pay attention to the human rights of all people, including those who are less well off than ourselves. And we might think of the American South in the 1940s and 50s and 60s. There were a few white people, not very many, a few white people who stuck their necks out and tried to do the right thing for black people's human rights. We thank them now with the retrospection of a few decades. And if we can fix the problems that our guests are talking about, we'll be able to look back in the future and say, wow, we did some good stuff to fix these, to reach out and connect with people and make the changes. Our American values require this, and the future will thank us for it. I want to thank Lisa Seifert, Erika Marques-Santillan, and Jenny Blumenstein. I want to thank all the folks who are watching. For information, you can contact Bridges Not Walls. You can contact the Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation for referrals or other information you may need. We're all one human family. We all share one planet. We can create a better world, but we all have to work at it. And the world needs what you have to offer. Thanks for watching.